So the topic of our final panel for today is Advocacy Without Borders, and we're going to concentrate on international GR experience. And we have two brilliant participants here in person and one online. So in person here we have Felix Lee to my left, who is the Director of Government Affairs at MedAsian, specializing in policy advocacy and stakeholder engagement within healthcare sector. And on my right, we have Stephen Blank, who is an internationally recognized expert on Eurasian, European, and Asian security, energy policy, and global strategy. So he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute Eurasia program and formerly served as senior expert for Russia and at the US Institute of Peace. And do we have our online participants? Yes? So, and online we have Sorin Han, who is a senior European government relations and public affairs strategist and managing partner at the European Affairs Consulting Group in Brussels. And besides that, he had served in multiple core institutions of the European Union, including the European Parliament, European Commission, and the Council of the European Union. So we have quite a diverse group today, perfectly fit to discuss international GR experience. And my first question would be to all participants. And so what, to your opinion, are the key constraints and opportunities when conducting government relations across fundamentally different political and regulatory systems? So who would like to start?
Okay. What about the man on the Zoom? Is he? Okay. All right. In my experience,
This one works for sure.
hello? No? Okay.
Yeah.
Must be a Soviet mic. In my experience, the determining factor between democratic governments and authoritarian or even totalitarian governments is the fact that political advocacy in the democratic, or at least democratizing, which is not the same thing, republic takes place as much in public as it does behind closed doors. Whereas in the authoritarian, even totalitarian system, and we have enormous evidence about this in the Soviet sphere and presumably as well in communist China, political advocacy and lobbying takes place, and it's quite brisk, but it all takes place behind closed doors, and you have to decipher what we used to call the Aesopian language, that is out of Aesop's fables, among the participants who are advocating for various political solutions that advance their factional or bureaucratic interest. Because in those states, politics are bureaucratic politics exclusively. Whereas in a democracy like the US, Canada, Great Britain, European states, we have bureaucratic politics. There's no doubt about that. Anybody who's served on Capitol Hill knows that quite intimately, because you have all these bureaucracies coming up and arguing for a larger and ever larger share of the budget and for particular pet issues of theirs. But what you also have is a very robust and quite transparent public sector that keeps a check on the bureaucracy and also advances non-bureaucratic interests as well. So that's the fundamental dividing line or constraint, if you like, in political advocacy. And that's the case today in the United States, as opposed, let us say, to Russia. For example, in Russia, when the military budget comes up, you have the Army, Navy, and Air Force and the strategic rocket forces, or strategic missile forces, are each arguing for a larger slice of the share of the military budget, or for a larger military budget altogether. Now, that's going on in the United States, but whereas in Russia, that happens behind closed doors, here, first of all, it happens in testimony before the Hill, as anybody who's worked on the Hill knows. It also happens in the public media, because people are advocating either online or in various journals or in public speeches for their particular interest. And of course, the Defense Department is advocating for a larger budget, both bureaucratically and publicly, as opposed to, let's say, the Health and Human Services or Homeland Security or Agriculture, and those departments are also doing the same thing. So really, what you have as a dividing line and a fundamental constraint is the degree to which politics is conducted out in the open or strictly behind closed doors.
Thank you. So we should be looking at the system of checks and balances and the transparency. Okay, so we lost the second.
Well, yes, we should.
Yeah,
I think I'm loud enough to just I think that's an excellent question, and about checks and balances of power, and it's interesting to see China's political system and how much it plays in a global environment that's flux right now, and also becoming more increasingly competitive. I know a lot of my peers in the GR industry, in the lobbying industry, work in an environment that shapes by election, the parliament, and also political campaign. And so I think it might be useful for me to share a few points on the perspective on how government relations work in China, mostly from a corporate government affairs professional experience. So, but just to kind of get it started on the overview of the political system. So, I mean, China's system, often, I don't know if that's how it's described in the United States, but it's a one-party leadership with multi-party consultation. That's how, like, the official term by the Chinese government. And what this means in practice, I think, is obvious. The Communist Party of China, the CPC, is the key governing body, and lays out the overall policy direction, for China. But there are several democratic parties and non-party members from different sectors, that serve more as a consultative purposes. That participate in the policy conversation, discussion, that shapes the policy development, and we like to call it, the years around the emperors, so of course that differs from most of the Western democracies, which are more shaped by, influenced by, the election, electoral competitions. So, but speaking of the voices around the emperor, I want to also bring up the two session. Just before I get into that, how many of you guys heard of the two sessions, China's two sessions before?
Yeah.
Because only two. So two sessions, a very important political gathering, the highest on the government's agenda each year. And that is, there are two major parties to that. One is the NPC, the National People's Congress, which they are a key legislative body for all the big policy direction, the decision. And so the latest two sessions just concluded a few weeks ago, earlier in the March. And it's an important one because this year China launched the 15th five-year plan. So if you know that China does the 5-year economic plan and the policy plan, and they have to be approved by the NPC. So this year they did that, the two session. And also the other party is Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPC, which they are, on the other hand, is more like a national policy consultation. So it includes representatives from, democratic parties, industry leaders, people in the academic space, and experts. So during the two sessions, normally, hundreds, if not thousands, of policy proposals are submitted, and they'll eventually shape into a policy conversation. So understanding the the political framework and how the government is structured, where do GA or in China they don't call it lobbyists, but the government relationship people come into the picture here. I think in short, I mean, in many of the Western markets, I'm assuming the GA professionals mainly focus on engaging the legislators, the regulators, and the best time to shape policy making is often before the election cycle. But I think in China, like you said, a lot of things are behind the door for one. But in short, I think policy advocacy in China is less about the short term advocacy, but more about like long term relationship building, and that's kind of also related to the Asian culture. Like it's built on trust. So I think some of the key differences, of China's, the GA engagement work compared to the West is that one's the timing. So election cycle versus more of a long term trust building that's being one, and also the nature of the engagement I think is very different here. In my opinion, in the West democracies, they're more transactional. They're more like issue based. You have an issue, you go to your legislators. Things can be probably solved fairly quicker. And in China, it's more about the strong emphasis on consistency and credibility, and everything have to be sort of advocated within a framework. So I would like to think of it as a if you got a cold, right? Like in America, you get a NyQuil, right? It treats your symptoms quick. Whereas in China, like people, just, intake the Chinese medicines, which it kind of takes time for you to cure. It doesn't just treat the symptoms right away. And also, I think another part is the influence channel. So, like I mentioned, like engagements in the West is more on engaging with the legislators, whereas in China, it's more engaging with the broader ecosystem. So, I think that comes to another a few points is that so the GR relationship in China, the environment is also adapting with maybe two decades ago, a lot of the relationship are built on a personal relationship with the government stakeholder. We like to call it GR 1.0, sorry. And what that does is a lot of how the business wants the government to support them are that arrangements are built on the dinner table or golf courses. They're more like personal relationship. But China launched the anti-corruption campaign, and that has been going on for a while, over the last 15 years. And then so that made government engagement with business become more wary. Like government stakeholders now are like they're more calculated in terms of engaging with business community in China for both multinational and domestic. So it's more selected approach. We like to call it GR 2.0. And nowadays, we feel like the landscape in policy advocacy in GR is shaping to a 3.0 approach. And what that means is that government and business are likely to find a common ground, something like an industry association or think tanks, and roundtables organized by industry association, and to talk about policy issues, policy shaping, that might have a impact to the up to the top. So and we like to call that GR 3.0, and a lot of the GA works slash lobbying or government relations are more in the in that space. So yeah, I guess with that, I conclude my thoughts here, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Felix. I think those insights are very important for us coming to work with China from American or European perspective. And speaking of the European perspective, do we have Soren online? Hello?
Yes, hello.
Okay, excellent. Soren, could you please tell us some of your insights about like what are the key constraints and opportunities when doing GR in very different environments, which is a huge part of your job?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, we have very different environments in Europe, of course. Europe is, you can define Europe in different ways, of course. We often see in the core these 27 member states of the European Union, of course. And around that, we have a couple of other countries which often have applied for membership in the European Union. So we see very different realities, of course. Now, if we focus a little bit on the European Union as the core of the whole political dynamic of Europe, we have to see that, of course, power is divided in Europe, and that is creates complexity, of course, for everyone who wants to influence something. Power is divided in line and based on the treaties of the European Union, and this system is not so easy to understand often from the outside, because it's somehow like a mix of a federal state system and the system of an international organization. So the European Union constitutionally stands a little bit in between and has a very specific mix of competencies and responsibilities for each policy field. So some political areas are highly centralized, like the European single market or environmental legislation in many fields. Even our trade policy is very much a European Union competence. But other fields like take cultural policy, but also still defense, for instance, is mainly a matter of the member states. And that makes it often difficult to understand what really is decided in which field, in which capital, let's say. And it creates complexity, of course, for any organization that wants to make its voice heard when decisions are coming up. Europe is complexity by nature, we could say. And we have still in 2026, of course, very different realities also when it comes maybe to the perception of lobbying, also when it comes to the degree, I would say, of professionalization, or when it comes to innovation in the methodology of interest representation. We see quite different realities. Many things were initially influenced either by the United States or were influenced by the United Kingdom in many cases, where a lobby culture was created pretty early. And then from there it triggered down to Brussels often, and from Brussels then into other member states. And so this is when you look at the situation today in 2026, you see that some European countries have very refined lobby cultures and landscapes, like when you look at Germany or France or at Nordic countries or the Netherlands, for instance. But in other countries, you see that things are a little bit like they were maybe in Northern Europe 10, 15 years ago. When you go to Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, you often still find lobbying structures which are very much based on individuals who have their relations to people or parties, and not so much this structured approach you have in Washington, for instance, or that we have in Brussels with many agencies, many direct representations of companies, of associations, etc. So we do have very different realities still when you look at Europe. And a good lobbyist, of course, has to put these things together, has to see it with an integral view, and ideally exercises influence in Brussels and in parallel in at least some of the member states' capitals. So this is the field, the landscape we are operating in, and it has to be understood really who decides what first before you can deploy your strategy.
Thank you so much. And with this in mind, and minding also your time, I would jump to direct questions and start with you. So if dwelling on what you have just said and mention the key structural differences in policy making between the US and in the EU. So if there would be a company which was going to aim in at doing GR both in the US and in Europe, so what kind of advice would you give for the company to adapt to each concrete environment with this regard?
Yes, first of all, understanding the enormous differences which are out there. Of course, the United States have a very different system that knows basically only two parties, which is something that is unusual for most Europeans, of course, that you have only two parties represented. Many countries have 5, 6, maybe 10, 12 parties sitting in their parliaments. The methodology is also different. Many things are based in the US on financial transactions, on party support that you do with financial means, etc. These things tend to have less importance in Europe. But many things are also similar. If you don't have a clear, concise position that you can bring across to policymakers, if you cannot build win-win situations with policymakers, then of course you're starting from a very bad basis. So I think what is very important in Europe, more than anywhere else, maybe, is to have a very good long-term strategy for your purpose. Because if you don't have a strategy, you will not manage the complexity between the different capitals in Brussels. So planning and strategic approach is really fundamental if you want to have any sort of success with policymakers in Europe.
Thank you so much, Soren. And speaking of complexities and regulations, Felix, you work in pharmaceuticals, so this is one of the most complex and severely regulated spheres, and you have to operate with different countries, different continents, and different mentalities. So, what are the key insights from your work with such different and sometimes conflicting regulatory approaches?
Yeah, it's that's an excellent point. I think I'll start with healthcare policy environment in China first, just because most of our client bases are multinational healthcare companies in medical device sector that that's trying to build up their business in the Middle Kingdom. So in case of the China policy environments, I think some of the effective approaches to multinational healthcare companies, but also multinational American companies in general, is to try to find an interlinkage of global GR approach with a local twist that fits the China's policy priorities. So as I mentioned earlier, so the two sessions just happened, and one of the sector that the government wasn't pulling back, even despite a larger economic slowdown, is healthcare. And then why is that? I think because of one, China is experiencing an aging population, and then also with the impacts of COVID, that China is doubling down on investment, but all in the healthcare sector, but also healthcare is largely related to advanced manufacturing, and so that's something that the government wants to gradually build up, and the market is actually still looking pretty good for healthcare companies. For one, I think I've read a report somewhere. Globally, 37% of the molecules were developed in China. Molecules being a fancy term for pharmaceutical products, and just 5 years ago, it was only 5%. So the market is still there. But in terms of policy direction in the healthcare space, we're seeing a stronger emphasis on the central policy planners on the clinical value, the healthcare quality, localization, and those are the policy terms that companies have to sort of abide to down the road. And I think for multinational companies to further looking at the GR strategy, but also how that is tied to the global business strategy, is one, how much they can influence on the standards, and two is what kind of product they'll bring. Because back in the days when you think of the China market, you're like, I'm bringing the products, but now it's like I have to double down on production here. So that could be an opportunity and a challenge. And also, things can get more tricky with China is that, there's more data regulation, which is tied to the healthcare space. So that brings the challenge. And a few things that, we see some of the companies that do in practice, but also we're helping companies to do, is to really shifting the gear from reactive to GA approach to something that's proactive. And what does that mean is that, a lot of the policies are, you wanted to influence that, earlier in the stage with different departments, different regulators, that before, earlier in the game, before the policies rolled out. And also another part is it's a ground up level. So, back in the day, a lot of healthcare companies trying to influence the central level and then try to, that goes down to different provinces. But now it's like, China is doing so much pilot programs. So, engaging on the local government, maybe it's more effective just because, local governments have more incentive, where a central planner set the policy direction. And also, my last point on the GR approach in the healthcare sector policy environment in China is that, really looking for what stakeholders are helpful to engage because, as I mentioned about 2 sessions, as I mentioned about, how different parties still have influence in the central government. So, really, building up stakeholder alignment throughout the years are, I think, 3 of the things that are helpful for multinational companies, in China. I know I'm a little bit short on time, but then, of course, on the vice versa for healthcare companies to invest in other markets, for Chinese healthcare companies to invest in other markets. I think there are high regulation in the United States as well. There's Biosecure Act, which has an impact on Chinese business who are seeking in this area, and the similar things, data regulation in Europe. I think those are also creating barriers too. So I think there are challenges and opportunities on both sides of the Pacific here. So with that, I'll conclude my thoughts here. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Felix. And this was a deep dive into very, let's say, industry-specific area of GR. But now I would like to zoom out and finish strong because this is the last panel. So we have to go a little bit more global. And of course, speaking of GR, we have to admit that governments are changing, and we can't ignore the fact that there are elections in the US this year. So I would like to ask you, how do you think the Ukrainian and Israeli agenda is going to impact the policy narratives and strategies during these elections this year?
Things being equal, that is, if no major change takes place in the Ukrainian war, I don't think Ukraine is going to influence the American election outcomes this year. You may disagree with that, and we can discuss that for the rest of the panel. On the other hand, whatever the course of the war with Iran, I think it will have a major impact on election outcomes for a number of reasons. Now, obviously, if the United States is able to pull off with Israel a quick victory, and I have to say I'm very skeptical that this is going to happen, then that will redound to President Trump's and the Republican Party's benefit. On the other hand, if this war, and I think it will, becomes a protracted war, it's already, I think, longer than the administration actually, or at least President Trump actually expected, then I think that it's going to contribute to the already rising signs of a democratic tide in the elections and will intensify that outcome. Now, the reasons for that, I think, are many. First of all, it's an unpopular war. You all know that. I think everybody here has seen the public opinion polls on TV or in social media or wherever. The public is against this war. Now, if we win, that's going to change. It's going to change, obviously. However, right now, the public is against it, and what's more is the longer this war goes on, the issues that have been driving public unhappiness with the Trump administration are going to be magnified by the developments of this war. First of all, energy prices. Let me give you an example. I live in Silver Spring. So 3 weeks ago when the war started, gas in my neighborhood was about $2.95, $2.90 a gallon. Today it's $4.50. That's over 50% increase, right there. That's not counting when you go to the grocery store or you go to buy anything that has an energy component built into its price, the inflation that's going to take place in the price of that commodity or that service. That plays into the whole issue of affordability, which, as you know, Trump is denied. The public clearly is feeling inflationary pressure even before this war started. Trump has denied it. The public disputes that, and that's become more acute and will become still more acute the longer this war goes on. And, the White House is clearly sensitive to that. For example, this announcement yesterday that we had talked to Iran turns out not to have been true. But it was made because Trump wanted to calm the markets. So that happened for about 6 or 8 hours. By the end of the day, the markets had already figured out that this was not the case, and they reverted back to the pessimism which you saw today in the morning and probably throughout the day today, because there is no sign of genuine negotiation or of a rapid conclusion to this war taking place. So you have a pre-existing unrest about affordability. You have a pre-existing unrest about the Democratic, and I don't mean that in terms of the Democratic Party, but Democratic with a small d, credentials of this administration, which has made it clear that it does not feel the need to consult with Congress, that it doesn't see the need to be bound by law, and went ahead and started this war without consultation with Congress, and as a result, that's going to be held against it, depending on if the result is a protracted or worse war. Third, and this is perhaps the most dangerous, on both the extreme of the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, you have an increasingly anti-Semitic, and there's no other word to describe it, movement. This is already expressing itself in violence both in the United States and in Europe. If you saw what happened yesterday in London, just to give you an example, with 4 Jewish volunteer ambulances were torched. It's happening all over the continent, not just in London. It's happening here in the United States, as we see in the news. And if you are Jewish or have Jewish friends, they can tell you this from their own personal experience. A rising tide of this in both the Republican Party and among the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now, it calls itself anti-Israel, but the argument is that we went to war in Iraq because Israel persuaded us to, or is most extreme formulation that I've seen, said that we are acting as Israel's proxy, which is, all of this is nonsense. Donald Trump doesn't act as anybody's proxy. But the inability of the United States government to give a compelling justification as to why we went to war, or an objective for this war, adds to that, as does the frustration that is already mounting with the course of the war. Furthermore, we have people in social media who have large followings who are insistently banging that drum. For example, Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, who are outright anti-Semites. And if they were here, I'd say it to their face. They might deny it, they might get all upset about that, but that's the truth. And it's not hard to figure this out. I mean, all you have to do is substitute the word black word Israel or Jew in their rhetoric, and you see right away the racist and anti-Semitic animus here. So that's a major factor, because if you hold the administration responsible for this war, or you hold Israel responsible for this war, and the war has gone badly, as is increasingly looking to be the case, then you're going to vote accordingly. And since these sentiments are being reinforced every day on a mass scale in social media, if not public media, that, the affordability, the protracted war in the Middle East, the idea that Trump has lied, and so on, are all going to contribute to a negative outcome for Republicans in the election, but may also work against progressive Democrats who, because they will be also against Democrats rather, because they will be tarred with the same brush as the progressives, and they will be, or the progressives will tar them with the brush that they are responsible for this war by their silence. So this is extremely negative in terms of the likely outcome of the war.
Thank you so much. And I just have to say that as a Ukrainian, I'm very happy to hear for a difference that Ukraine is not influencing the American elections this time.
Not at all.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank my co-panelists for being both insightful and very structured and time-wise mindful. And if that's so, we were super efficient, so we have time for maybe one question. And if not, I would like to invite our
I have a question.
You have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question to Mr. Lee about generally how lobbying regulated in China.
How lobbyists regulated in China?
Yeah. Is it some like register for government?
Yes. So I think that goes back to the different political system. So lobbying, I think, for one, because China's lobbying does not impact any political outcome. So it's more of I think it's more of a long-term relationship building rather than it's like a short-term. You're lobbying for certain issues, and then how that will affect an outcome. So so your lobbying really, like, they just don't like to say that word, but policy advocacy, the word within the framework of the political environment, and then how different actors fit in this framework, and then so it's more multi-layered. I think that's a word I like to use. It's like you gotta of course engage in the central policy plan makers, and then but also local government play also a decisive role with their pilot programs for different sectors with something that the central level government doesn't know if it's the right thing to do, but the local governments were willing to try, and then if it works, they'll go translate back up to the central level. So I think that's one way to sort of perceive it. But also, like I mentioned earlier, I think industry organizations and think tanks are good engagement platforms for policy advocacy / lobbying. Just because with a lot, the anti-corruption campaign right now, I'm not going to comment whether it's good or bad, but it's making government people more wary of engaging with, people who either speak on behalf of companies or company executives. So like that, they normally go through like a middle ground, and then but a lot of the advisors for the government are they're also part of the think tanks for the industry associations. So I think lobbying through that channel is also an effective strategy. I'm not sure if that answers your question. So I think it's just like people do that, but it's just the what and the how is a little bit different from most of the Western democracies.
Thank you, Felix.
Thank you.
So I think now we're ready for the concluding remarks.
Yeah.
Katerina, please.